Hello. Fortunately, my phone did not fall as I pressed this button to record, which is good progress, I suppose. It speaks to a slow and steady improvement, I suppose, in the production value that is being undergone here. And so this video, as I've titled it, "Silence is the Language of God." There's a certain sense of irony, I suppose, in sorry, I'm just scratching my leg. I was stung by a stinging nettle, and it's probably going to be pestering my mind throughout the recording of this. But it's just the adversity that you have to reckon with. But mild waffle, amble, distraction. Yeah. So silence is the language of God. This is something I, derived from a Rumi quote, and I thought, I would use that to spur, ironically, what I'm going to talk about, and that's it's an interesting thing. It's kind of like speaks to the sort of the start and end of spiritual discourse, I suppose, that one must relinquish back into silence, and it sort of suggests you know a certain kind of futility, maybe, or an inherent distractibility to the words, the conceptual pointers that we use when we are talking about meditation, um, and spiritual related topics. But regardless of all of this, I still feel compelled to sort of to talk about it, and but with that sort of inherent kind of self consciousness, with the language that we use. And yeah, and like the second part of that quote, silence is the language of God, um, follows with, all else is poor translation. And that's an interesting thing to contemplate, because you know there is a sort of a very strong tendency of the mind and the conceptual mind to lead us to get lost within these sort of linguistic models, linguistic cages. We live according to the thoughts that we have, and our thoughts almost lead the way we engage with reality. And this can be a sort of a good or bad thing. Many mental pathologies can be sort of conceived as sort of disorders of thought. You know, where thought becomes quite destructive, whether it's sort of destructively painting a negative picture of oneself, the world, the future, the past, and you know I'm well acquainted with how thought can be a very corrosive kind of force within the world. But then it's easy to overemphasize these sort of destructive qualities of thought, because you know despite all that, we are sort of humans, and we are sort of, whether you can call it condemned, we are sort of led um, to want to think about the world, to think about ourselves and what we're doing. There isn't, we shouldn't over pathologize thought, but we should recognize its useful place in, you know, orienting and orchestrating our engagement with the world. Would it be more adaptive, more useful to go around with a totally blank mind? For most people who wouldn't consider themselves, these fully enlightened Buddha characters, that just isn't practical. You know, we need to think day in, day out. You know, in order to survive, to continue existing. And but I guess, you know, for most of us, we can't avoid thinking. But what we can do, I suppose, is to find or, you know, remember moments of extended silence. Even when, you know, your mind is rapid and it feels like this violent stream sometimes, which is uncontrollable, disordered, and just wild. And you think, fuck, how can I control this thing so it's, you know, not thinking all these things? But, you know, there is really no controlling of thought, of the next thought the next thought that emerges. You know, there's a kind of a natural spontaneity to it. And you know, there's a natural spontaneity as well to silence, I suppose. You know, it can grip you in sort of the most unexpected moments where you're just there enjoying a good song or just out in nature, just not forcing anything, but rather allowing just, you know, the natural rhythms of your body, your physiology, your environment to just be, without forcing it to conform to any sort of cognitive or conceptual expectations that you have. You're just, you know, flowing with it, to use that terminology. And you know, this flowing, it can feel like you're sort of relaxing a muscle that most of the time is, you know, contracted. It's a relaxing and opening, and you know, and it's interesting to think about how, you know, we go about our lives, our days, in a slightly contracted and resistant kind of state. Often, you know, unconsciously. You know, whether you're, say, in a social situation and you feel a sort of a contraction when you're trying to say something, you know, a contraction where you're worried about, you know, what's this person thinking of me? Do they like me? Are they bored? Or am I saying this thing, that thing? You know, I feel like, for me at least, you know, when I am sort of pathologically lost in thought, it is a very sort of contracted and resistant state. And it's almost like, you know, your mind, the natural rhythms of the mind is like a stream, and it has certain currents that naturally flow in a certain direction, you know, and this certain direction maybe is dictated by the overwhelming weight of history that led to you being in that moment. But then, you know, you're there and you have a certain idea of, like, you know, I want to do this thing, I want to be that thing, you know, and then you're resisting that sort of, that natural flow, that natural current, and this kind of creates this sort of, you know, this contraction, this resistance, this kind of anxious, fearful energy. And I suppose meditation and sort of contemplation, paying attention to your sort of the natural rhythms of your mind, regardless of what they are, and not seeking to change it, to conform it, but rather to accept, attend to it with a kind of, I wouldn't say indifference, but as with a kind of impartiality, that you're just sort of just there saying, okay, this is just what is happening right now, you know? And I suppose that recognition is a sort of, you know, we're all capable of remembering it all the time, because of course there is only the now. You know, the past and the future are these thought up narratives, maybe. You know, these things that we think in the present, in the now. And there's always just the now, the now, the now. It's a circle. But then there is still, you know, this sense of linear time, you know, of that we are moving somewhere in the future, that the past is somehow fixed and you know, unchangeable, but the future is a realm of probabilistic potentiality. But and I, you know, I've got a bit, you know, I wouldn't say sidetracked. I say this just flowed from, you know, the initial um, pointer or trigger, I suppose, for this video, that silence is the language of God. And I went from that to talking about time and the movement of time, and you know, how are we as organisms sort of moving through this world. But I guess sort of, you know, the general sort of conclusion, the general sort of point that I'm trying to sort of convey is, you know, the usefulness. Well, I don't know. If I talk about it in terms of usefulness, I feel like I'm reducing contemplation and meditation to its instrumental value. And almost when you're reducing something to its instrumental value, you're reducing it to the benefits it may bring in the future. And, you know, that's not to, and certainly, I suppose, having a more contemplative attitude to the world, you know, it will will very frequently bring more peace in the future. And maybe I shouldn't knock that, but I guess, you know, I guess if anything, you know, talking about the value of silence, we should be thinking about, you know, not only its value in the future, but also its inherent value in the now, because of course there is only the now. And it's not to say that through recognizing this timeless element of silence, it's not to say that recognizing it is going to evaporate all your problems in the present, because often our problems in the present are these deeply rigid and accumulated patterns that have, you know, like a snowball that rolls down a mountain. It accumulates a lot and lot of weight, and it's maybe an unfair expectation to think that simply meditating will evaporate all your problems immediately. Meditation is certainly valuable, but I say, particularly even in my case, and I think many people can attest to this, there can almost be, when you do start to consciously do this sort of thing, it can almost bring more suffering, more adversity, at least in the short term, because you are sort of bringing to the foreground of your mind all these sort of deep patterns, which are often, you know, quite aversive. And that can be very challenging if one goes about it in a sort of an unregulated way. And I think this is particularly the case with, psychedelic assisted meditative methods. Whilst I do certainly think that these are very extremely therapeutic and beneficial medicines when used in a sort of an unconscious manner or an uncontrolled manner without adequate respect. Psychedelic assisted therapy can be intensely traumatizing, and that I don't want to say that to create a sense of fear around these sort of things, but more to instill a sense of respect, because psychedelics are sort of they are bringing you into a temporary acquaintance with much more deeper aspects of your mind, your subconscious mind, and even deeper than that, where you start flirting with stuff which Jung might label as a collective unconscious. And if one is not prepared for that adequately, there are significant risks that are that can come up. And even simple meditation, there are certain risks with it as well, because you are becoming acquainted with the the more pre-conscious, unconscious elements of your mind, and that can be quite alarming, quite confronting for certain people. So, and I think especially even with meditation, like, people may have the attitude that it is something that you have to be sitting down in the lotus position in silence, closing your eyes. That's the quote-unquote correct way of meditating. But I think this misconstrues what meditation is. Meditation, for me, if I could touch some kind of brief description of how I understand it, it is simply the remembering of what you already are, and inherent to that is the notion that you can realize that wherever you are, whatever context you find yourself in. And in a weird sort of way, that's why sort of at a certain point with meditation, you never stop meditating, weirdly enough. Like, every moment becomes a moment for mindfulness, for awareness. And there's a beauty in that, because you are totally untethered, And, when I think back to when I started meditating, I was more motivated by the sort of Western depiction of it as a kind of, almost a slightly capitalistic kind of activity which could strengthen my mind or strengthen my focus, reduce stress, all this sort of, these benefits. And it was only after sort of, at a certain point of getting more immersed in it, thinking about it more, reading more about it and stuff, that I started to realise the more esoteric, the more spiritual, mildly psychedelic side, I suppose, mind expanding, whatever, I don't know. But and I was caught off guard with that, because it is sort of it's it confronted me, I suppose, with some of the issues, I suppose, in the way that meditation is marketed, particularly in the West, capitalistic, individualistic nations, communities, societies. So yeah, some food. I can't pronounce words anymore. The light is shining on my face. Recorded for an hour, 20 minutes. They just fly by, these things. I don't know. It's weird. So I just start talking, and then suddenly it'll be like 15, 20, 25 minutes, and I'm like, what the frig? You know, what have I been talking about? It's just a blur. But I enjoy this format quite intensely. You know, it feels so natural and free, and yeah, um, yeah, it's quite nice to have this opportunity to just speak and let whatever is, you know, is bubbling just out. It's kind of like becoming a muse, I suppose, where you sort of empty yourself such that whatever can just flow out. And maybe that can create a sense of disorder, a sense of dysregulation, but I don't know, I don't think it's been too dysregulated. But yeah, I hope that's been useful. Hope you've enjoyed it. I don't know whether I should say all the stereotypical things that people say at the end of videos, like and subscribe and comment, and so that the algorithmic robots promote my shit, because that's obviously all I care about. Status and acclaim and fame and all that stuff. I don't know. Adios, peeps. Enjoy the rest of your day. Boop-a-doop.